The radio crackled with static at 3:47 hours, breaking the suffocating silence that had settled over forward operating base whiskey like a burial shroud. Staff Sergeant Miguel Santos pressed his headset closer, straining to catch the fragmented transmission bleeding through the atmospheric interference. What he heard made his blood turn to ice water in his veins. Mayday, Mayday, Viper 7 down, coordinates, enemy contact, multiple KIA. The transmission cut to static, leaving only the hum of generators and the distant rumble of thunder that might have been artillery. Santos stared at the communications array, his weathered face illuminated by the green glow of radar screens. In 23 years of military service, he'd never heard panic quite like that in a SEAL team leader's voice. Lieutenant Colonel Rebecca Torch Valdez stood in the shadows of the operations tent, her steel-gray eyes fixed on the tactical display showing a red X marking the last known position of the reconnaissance team. She'd been reviewing flight schedules when the distress call came through, but now every muscle in her compact frame was coiled like a spring. The other officers hadn't noticed her yet, they rarely did. At 5'4" with graying temples and laugh lines that spoke of too many years squinting into hostile skis, Torch had learned to move through military spaces like smoke. "Sir, we've lost contact with Viper 7, Santos reported to Major Harrison, the base commander. Last transmission indicated heavy enemy contact, possible casualties. Harrison's face went pale beneath his regulation mustache. The SEAL team had been inserted 12 hours ago on what should have been a routine reconnaissance mission. Now they were dark, somewhere in the mountains where Taliban forces moved like ghosts through terrain they'd known since childhood. "Options?" Harrison demanded, his voice betraying the weight of command decisions that could cost lives. "Dawn's still 3 hours out," Captain Myers, the intelligence officer, said while studying satellite imagery. "We could scramble the quick reaction force, but they're flying blind without close air support. The weather's closing in fast." Thunder rolled across the valley, punctuating his words with ominous finality. Storm clouds were building against the mountains, pregnant with the kind of weather that grounded helicopters and made rescue missions suicidal. Torch stepped forward from the shadows, her flight suit pristine despite having been on duty for 18 hours. "I can be airborne in 15 minutes, she said quietly. The tent fell silent except for the patter of rain beginning to strike the canvas. Harrison looked at her as if she'd suggested flying to the moon. Myers actually laughed, a short, dismissive sound that cut through the tension like a blade. "Torch, you're scheduled for cargo runs," Harrison said, his tone gentle but firm. "This is combat search and rescue we need." "You need someone who can find them and keep them alive," she interrupted, her voice carrying the weight of absolute certainty. "That's what I do." Major Harrison had never seen Torch fly combat missions. Few people had. Most of the younger pilots knew her as the quiet woman who ran supply missions with mechanical precision, who never spoke up in briefings, who seemed content to let the hotshots take the glory runs. They didn't know about her 3 tour in Iraq, about the Congressional Medal of Honor citation gathering dust in her footlocker, about the night she'd held a position alone against an entire insurgent cell while calling in strikes on her own coordinates. They were about to learn. The storm was building momentum, and somewhere in those mountains, American warriors were fighting for their lives in the darkness. The clock was ticking, and dawn felt like a lifetime away. But Torch Valdez had never waited for dawn to bring the fire. The rain began in earnest as she walked toward the flight line, each step measured and purposeful. Behind her, the operations tent buzzed with frantic activity as officers tried to piece together contingency plans that didn't involve sending a single-engine attack aircraft into the worst weather the region had seen in months. They were thinking like bureaucrats, not warriors. Torch thought like both. Staff Sergeant Martinez was already pre-flighting her, Thunderbolt II when she arrived at the hardstand. The aircraft squatted on the tarmac like a mechanical predator, its twin engines gleaming despite the rain. Most pilots called the A-10 the Warthog, but Torch had always thought of hers differently. This particular aircraft, tail number 810977, had been with her for 8 years and 3 deployments. Its titanium bathtub cockpit bore scars from ground fire, and its GAU-8 Avenger cannon had dispensed justice across 2 continents. "Weather's getting nasty, ma'am," Martinez shouted over the wind. "Towers reporting visibility dropping fast in the mountains." "How's she look?" Torch asked, running her hand along the aircraft's flank like a rider checking a horse before a dangerous ride. "Ready to hunt," Martinez replied, understanding passing between them like lightning. They'd worked together long enough to communicate in shorthand. Torch climbed into the cockpit with the fluid motion of someone who'd performed the ritual thousands of times. The familiar smell of avgas and electronics welcomed her home. Her hands moved across switches and displays with unconscious precision, breathing life into systems that transformed aluminum and steel into an instrument of surgical violence. The radio crackled as Harrison's voice filled her headset. "Torch, be advised, weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. Recommend you hold position until visibility improves." "Negative whiskey base," she replied, her voice steady as granite. "Viper 7 doesn't have until visibility improves." She didn't wait for a response. The twin General Electric TF-34 engine spun to life, with a rising whine that cut through the storm like a prayer. Ground crews scattered as she taxied toward the active runway, navigation lights painting red and green streaks through the rain. The tower controller's voice was tight with concern. "Dragon 77, winds gusting to 40 knots, visibility 3 miles and decreasing. You're cleared for takeoff, but recommend." "Dragon 77 rolling," Torch interrupted, pushing the throttles forward. They accelerated down the rain-slicked runway with deceptive grace. At 140 knots, Torch pulled back on the stick, and 810977 lifted into the storm with the determination of something born to fly in impossible conditions. Lightning flickered through the clouds ahead, illuminating a landscape that seemed designed to swallow aircraft and crews without leaving trace. But Torch Valdez had been swallowed by worse storms than this one, and she'd always found her way back to the light. As she climbed through the turbulence, her thoughts turned to the men waiting in the mountains. SEALs were the best warriors America produced, but even the best could die if left alone in the dark. They were counting on someone to find them, to stand between them and whatever forces wanted them dead. She checked her weapons systems with professional detachment. The GAU-8 showed ready, 1,150 rounds of 30 ammunition waiting in the drum. Her pylons carried a mixed load, AGM-65 Maverick missiles for hardened targets, and enough ordnance to level a city block if necessary. But her most important weapon wasn't mounted on any pylon. It was the tactical instinct that had kept her alive through 67 combat sorties. The storm tried to tear her aircraft apart as she flew deeper into the mountains. Wind shear battered the A-10 like an angry fist, but the Warthog was built to absorb punishment. Torch rode the turbulence with the patience of someone who understood that nature, like enemies, respected only those who refused to yield. Her radar painted a picture of terrain that rose like the backbone of some sleeping giant. Peaks disappeared into cloud cover so thick it seemed solid, and valleys twisted through the landscape like knife wounds. Somewhere in that maze of stone and shadow, 8 of America's finest warriors were fighting for their lives. The clock on her instrument panel read for 12 hours. Dawn was still hours away, but Torch carried her own sunrise in the form of high-explosive ordnance, and the absolute conviction that no American would die on her watch if she could prevent it. The hunt had begun. Radio communications from the crash site had been sporadic at best, fragments of desperate voices calling for help through atmospheric interference that turned words into ghosts. But Torch had learned to read between the static, to hear what wasn't being said. The SEAL team had gone dark not because their radios were broken, but because they were being hunted by forces that used electronic surveillance to track targets. They were playing a deadly game of hide and seek in terrain that favored the hunters. Captain Alina, Viper, Morrison pressed her back against the rocky outcropping, feeling the cold seep through her tactical vest as she counted ammunition. 7 magazines left for her HK-416. Enough for one more firefight, maybe 2 if they were careful. Her team had been moving through the mountains for 6 hours since their helicopter went down, and the Taliban forces tracking them seemed to know exactly where they were going. "How's Hayes?" she whispered to Petty Officer Rodriguez, who was tending to their wounded medic behind a cluster of boulders. "Stable, but he needs real medical attention soon," Rodriguez replied, his voice tight with controlled worry. "The shrapnel did some damage." Morrison nodded, though Rodriguez probably couldn't see the gesture in the darkness. They were pinned in a position that offered good cover but no escape routes. The enemy had them surrounded on 3 sides, and the 4th led to a cliff face that dropped into nothing. Classic tactics: force your prey into a killing ground and wait for them to run out of options. She'd called in their coordinates twice, but the storm was playing havoc with communications. For all she knew, their distress signals were bouncing off the ionosphere into space, unheard by anyone who could help. "Movement 2 o'clock," whispered Chief Petty Officer Jackson, the team's sniper. His night vision scope painted the world in shades of green, revealing figures moving through the rocks below their position. Morrison counted muzzle flashes as the Taliban fighters tested their perimeter with probing attacks. 15, maybe 20 hostiles, professional movements, coordinated fire patterns. These weren't the usual ragtag militia they'd encountered on previous missions. Someone had sent real soldiers to kill them. The wind carried voices speaking Pashto, words that Morrison's limited vocabulary couldn't translate but whose tone was unmistakable. They were planning something, coordinating for a final assault that would come with the first light of dawn. "Viper 7, to any station, over," she whispered into her radio, knowing the transmission probably wouldn't reach friendly forces but trying anyway. Static answered her, filled with the sound of electromagnetic ghosts. Then, cutting through the interference like a blade through silk, came a voice that carried the authority of someone accustomed to bringing order to chaos. "Viper 7, this is Dragon 77. I've got your general area. Can you give me a better position?" Morrison's heart leaped. Close air support. Someone was coming for them. "Dragon 77, Viper 7 actual," she transmitted, trying to keep the relief out of her voice. "We're approximately 2 clicks northeast of our last known good, taking effective fire from multiple positions. 1 urgent surgical, need immediate extraction." "Copy that, Viper 7. I'm inbound your location. Can you mark your position?" Morrison looked at her team's faces, seeing hope flicker in their eyes for the first time since the helicopter went down. But hope was dangerous in their situation. It made you careless. "Negative on marking at this time," she replied. "Too much enemy activity. They're tracking our electronic signatures." The pilot's response carried something that might have been approval. "Smart girl. I'll find you the old-fashioned way." Above them, thunder rolled across the sky, except this thunder had a mechanical precision that spoke of twin jet engines pushing an aircraft through impossible weather conditions. The A-10 was up there somewhere, hunting in the darkness like a technological angel of death. Chief Jackson adjusted his scope, scanning for targets. "Ma'am, they're massing for an assault. Looks like they want to finish this before that bird finds us." Morrison checked her weapon one more time, feeling the familiar weight of steel and polymer in her hands. The SEAL teams had a saying: the only easy day was yesterday, but sometimes yesterday felt like a different lifetime. The enemy was closing in, dawn was still hours away, and their ammunition was running low. But for the first time since their helicopter had been shot down, Morrison felt something other than desperation. She felt like a warrior with backup coming. Torch banked her A-10 through a valley that seemed carved from the nightmares of aircraft designers. Peaks rose on either side like the walls of a cathedral built for giants, and the storm turned her cockpit into a light show of electrical discharge that made her instruments dance with false readings. She flew by instinct and experience, trusting her aircraft to carry her through conditions that would have grounded lesser pilots. The tactical frequency crackled with transmissions from Viper 7, professional voices reporting ammunition status and casualty, updates with the calm efficiency that marked elite warriors. But Torch could hear the underlying tension, the subtle signs that told her these soldiers were running out of time and options. She'd been there herself, 8 years ago in a place whose name was still classified. Surrounded, outnumbered, waiting for help that might never come. The taste of fear mixed with determination, the weight of responsibility for lives that depended on decisions made in microseconds. Dragon 77, be advised we have multiple heat signatures moving toward Viper 7's position, came the voice of the AWACS controller, electronic eyes painting a picture of the battlefield from 30,000 feet above the storm. Copy, Magic Eye. How many are we talking about? Count 15 to 20, moving in coordinated groups. Looks like they're setting up for a final push. Torch adjusted her heading, following electronic breadcrumbs toward the point where American warriors were making their last stand. The A-10's targeting systems were designed for this kind of work, finding enemies in complex terrain and eliminating them with surgical precision. But first, she had to locate her friendlies without getting them killed in the process. The radio crackled with Viper 7's voice. Dragon 77 were taking effective fire from the north and west. Enemy forces approximately 200 meters from our position. Viper 7, I need you to do something for me, Torch replied, her voice carrying the calm authority of someone who'd talked troops through similar situations before. On my mark, I want your point man to key his transmitter for exactly 5 seconds. No longer. Copy, Dragon standing by. Torch activated her electronic warfare systems, instruments that could detect radio transmissions and triangulate their source to within meters. It was a technique she'd learned from an old-school pilot who'd flown search and rescue in Vietnam, back when finding down aircrews meant getting creative with technology that wasn't designed for the mission. Mark, she transmitted. For 5 seconds, her instruments painted a precise location on the digital map displayed in her cockpit. Grid coordinates locked in, friendly positions identified. Now she could see the battlefield with electronic clarity. 8 friendlies in a defensive position, surrounded by hostile forces moving through approaches that offered concealment and multiple firing positions. It was a tactical situation that called for precision rather than raw firepower. The kind of mission that separated professional pilots from cowboys who thought close air support meant dropping the biggest bombs available. Viper 7, I've got your position. I'm going to make a low pass to identify target areas. Keep your heads down. Torch pushed the stick forward, diving toward terrain that rose to meet her like the fist of an angry god. At 500 feet above ground level, she activated her targeting pod, painting the battlefield with infrared sensors that revealed heat signatures moving through the rocks below. The image that filled her display made her jaw clench with professional anger. The Taliban forces had positioned themselves with tactical sophistication that spoke of professional military training. Interlocking fields of fire, covered approaches, coordinated movement patterns. Someone had taught these fighters how to hunt American special operations teams. But they'd made one critical mistake. They'd never fought an A-10 pilot who took it personally when people tried to kill her countrymen. Viper 7, I count 18 hostiles in 3 groups. I'm going to service the northern group first, then work my way around your perimeter. When I start my gun run, I want you to mark your position with a strobe light for exactly 3 seconds. Copy, Dragon, standing by for your attack. Torch climbed back into the storm, using the weather as cover while she positioned for her first attack run. The GAU-8 cannon was loaded with a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive rounds, each projectile capable of turning a human body into red mist. At 3,900 rounds per minute, the Avenger could deliver enough firepower to level buildings. But this mission called for scalpel work, not sledgehammers. She rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive that would have torn the wings off a lesser aircraft. The A-10 shuddered as it accelerated toward its target, wind shrieking across control surfaces designed to function in exactly these conditions. At 1,000 feet altitude, traveling at 450 knots, Torch acquired her first group of targets. The Taliban fighters were positioned among rocks that provided excellent concealment from ground-based observation, but they stood out like neon signs when viewed through thermal imaging from above. 6 men with automatic weapons, setting up a machine gun position that would have swept Viper 7's defensive perimeter with murderous fire. Torch centered the targeting pipper on the group and squeezed the trigger. The GAU-8 cannon erupted with a sound like the world's largest chainsaw, spitting 30 rounds at a rate that turned individual shots into a continuous roar of destruction. For exactly 1.2 seconds, depleted uranium projectiles traveling at 3,500 feet per second turned rock formations into dust clouds and enemy fighters into memories. The recoil was so violent it slowed the A-10 by 30 knots, but Torch was already pulling into a climbing turn that would position her for the next attack. Below, the northern approach to Viper 7's position had been cleared with surgical precision. "Good hits, Dragon," came Morrison's voice over the radio. "Northern sector is clear. We've got movement in the western approach." Torch banked through a turn that pressed her deeper into her ejection seat, blood pooling in her extremities as G-forces tried to drag consciousness from her brain. But she'd been pulling GS since before some of these Taliban fighters were born, and her body knew how to function under conditions that would incapacitate civilian pilots. The Western group had taken cover after witnessing the destruction of their comrades, but thermal imaging revealed their positions among the boulder fields. This group was larger, 8 fighters with rocket-propelled grenades and heavy machine guns. They'd chosen their positions well, using natural cover that would deflect most ordnance. Most but not all. Torch selected a pair of AGM-65 Maverick missiles from her weapons menu, each one carrying a 125-pound warhead designed to penetrate hardened targets. The missiles locked onto heat signatures with electronic determination, seeker heads painting targets with invisible laser designation that meant death was coming whether the enemy could see it or not. Viper 7 missiles inbound your position. Keep your heads down. She squeezed the trigger twice, feeling the A-10 shudder as 500 pounds of high explosive dropped away from the pylons and streaked toward Earth at twice the speed of sound. The Maverick missiles were fire-and-forget weapons, but Torch tracked their progress on her targeting display with professional interest. The first missile impacted in the center of the enemy position with a flash that briefly turned night into day. The second followed microseconds later, adding its warhead to a fireball that sent shockwaves through the mountain valley. When the smoke cleared, the western approach was a crater-scarred landscape that would trouble no one. "Western sector clear," Morrison reported, her voice carrying a note of awe that professional warriors reserved for truly impressive displays of firepower. But the battle wasn't over. Torch's electronic warfare sensors were painting new contacts moving toward Viper 7's position from the south, reinforcements arriving to avenge their fallen comrades. The Taliban commanders had committed more resources to this fight than intelligence had predicted. Someone wanted the SEAL team dead badly enough to risk significant assets in weather that grounded most aircraft. That suggested Viper 7 had stumbled onto something important during their reconnaissance mission, something worth killing American Special Operations troops to protect. Which meant Torch's mission had just become more complicated than a simple search and rescue operation. She was now flying combat air patrol for troops who might be sitting on intelligence that could shift the balance of power in the entire region. The stakes had just gotten higher, and dawn was still hours away. The southern group consisted of 12 fighters moving through terrain that offered excellent concealment from air attack. They'd learned from watching their comrades die, spreading out into smaller groups that made targeting more difficult. But they'd also made the mistake of underestimating what an A-10 pilot could accomplish with determination and the right ordnance. Torch climbed back into the storm, using clouds as concealment while she studied the tactical situation. The enemy was adapting, learning from each attack to improve their survivability. That suggested professional leadership and training that went beyond typical Taliban capabilities. These weren't local militia fighters defending their territory. They were professionals sent to accomplish a specific mission: eliminate Viper 7 before the SEAL team could extract with whatever intelligence they'd gathered. Dragon 77, this is Magic Eye, came the AWACS controller's voice. Be advised, we're tracking additional vehicles moving toward your area of operations. Count 6 technicals with mounted weapons, ETA 15 minutes. Technical vehicles, pickup trucks with heavy weapons mounted in their beds. Mobile platforms that could deliver significant firepower and then disappear into terrain before close air support could respond. The enemy was escalating, committing resources that suggested this fight had strategic importance. Copy Magic Eye. Viper 7, did you copy that transmission? Dragon 77, we copied, Morrison replied. Be advised, we recovered intelligence materials from our objective before going down. Package is still secure. There it was. Viper 7 had completed their reconnaissance mission and gathered intelligence that someone desperately wanted to prevent from reaching American command. The helicopter shoot-down, the professional enemy response, the willingness to commit significant resources in terrible weather, it all made sense now. This wasn't just about rescuing a downed SEAL team. It was about protecting intelligence that could save American lives or prevent future attacks. The mission had just shifted from search and rescue to combat escort, with Torch as the only thing standing between critical intelligence and the forces trying to destroy it. She checked her weapon's status with renewed focus. Ammunition for the GAU-8 was down to 800 rounds after the first gun run. She had 4 Maverick missiles remaining, plus a full load of 2.75-inch rockets for area suppression. Enough firepower to handle the current threats, but not enough to fight a protracted engagement against reinforcements. Viper 7, what's your ammunition status? She asked, knowing the answer would influence her tactical decisions. Dragon, we're down to 5 magazines rifle ammunition and 2 frags. Chief Jackson has maybe 20 rounds for the big gun. The big gun was military slang for their sniper rifle, probably a .300 Winchester Magnum capable of engaging targets at extreme range, but useless in a close-quarters fight against multiple enemies. The SEAL team was running on fumes, depending entirely on air support to survive until extraction. Torch banked into another attack run, this time approaching from the east to avoid establishing a predictable pattern. The southern group had taken cover among rock formations that would require precision targeting to avoid civilian casualties in nearby villages. Not that there were many civilians left in this region. Years of fighting had driven most of the population to refugee camps, but professional soldiers didn't make assumptions about collateral damage. She selected the GAU-8 cannon for the attack, configuring the weapons system for maximum precision. At 500 feet altitude, traveling at 400 knots, She would have exactly 2.3 seconds to engage targets before terrain forced her to climb back into the storm. The targeting pipper settled on the largest concentration of enemy fighters, men who'd made the mistake of clustering together for mutual support. Torch squeezed the trigger and held it down for exactly 1 second, sending 65 rounds of 30 ammunition into a space no larger than a basketball court. The GAU-8's depleted uranium rounds turned rock into powder and human bodies into component atoms. When the gun run was complete, the southern approach had been cleared with mechanical efficiency that left no room for survivors. But the technicals were still inbound, and Torch's ammunition was running low. The radio crackled with Morrison's voice. "Dragon 7-7, we've got eyes on vehicles approaching from the southwest. Request immediate engagement." Torch banked toward the new threat, her instruments painting a picture of 6 pickup trucks moving through valleys that provided concealment from air attack. Each vehicle carried a crew-served weapon, heavy machine guns or recoilless rifles capable of engaging both ground targets and low-flying aircraft. They were spreading out as they approached, making individual targeting more difficult. Professional tactics from professional soldiers. Someone had invested serious resources in training these fighters to engage American Special Operations teams. Viper 7, I'm going after the vehicles. Keep your heads down and be ready to move when I give the word. Torch selected her remaining Maverick missiles, programming them for multiple target engagement. The missiles would lock onto the largest heat signatures, vehicle engines that stood out against the cold mountain air like bonfires. 4 missiles, 6 targets. She'd have to make every shot count. The first pair of missiles streaked toward Earth like mechanical meteors, their seeker heads painting targets with invisible death. 2 technicals disappeared in fireballs that sent shockwaves through the valley, their ammunition exploding in secondary detonations that lit up the night sky. The remaining vehicles scattered, drivers realizing they were being hunted by something that could kill them before they even saw their attacker. But scattering made them easier targets, not harder ones. Isolated vehicles couldn't provide mutual support, and their heat signatures were clearly visible against the cold mountain terrain. Torch fired her 3rd and 4th missiles, tracking their progress on her targeting display. 2 more vehicles became expanding clouds of fire and debris, their crews eliminated before they could bring their weapons to bear on Viper 7's position. That left 2 technicals still moving toward the SEAL team's location, their crews undoubtedly aware they were being systematically destroyed, but committed to completing their mission. Fanatics or professionals, the distinction didn't matter when they were trying to kill American troops. Torch banked into a gun run that would take her directly over the remaining vehicles, accepting the risk of ground fire in exchange for decisive engagement. The GAU-8 cannon had enough ammunition for 2 more bursts, and she intended to make them count. The first technical died under a stream of 30 rounds that turned its engine block into scrap metal and its crew into memories. The second vehicle tried to take evasive action, weaving between rock formations that provided momentary concealment. But concealment wasn't cover, and thermal imaging revealed heat signatures that couldn't hide from electronic eyes. Torch's final gun run eliminated the last vehicle with surgical precision, leaving the battlefield quiet except for the sound of burning fuel and scattered ammunition cooking off in the fires. "All vehicles destroyed," she reported to Morrison. "Viper 7, what's your status?" "Dragon 7-7, we're secure at this location. Package is intact, 1 wounded but stable. We're ready for extraction when you can arrange it." Torch climbed back into the storm, checking her fuel gauges and ammunition status. She'd expended most of her ordnance, but the immediate threats had been eliminated. Now came the harder part, keeping the SEAL team alive until rescue helicopters could reach their position. The storm was intensifying, and dawn was still hours away. But for the first time since receiving Viper 7's distress call, Torch felt cautiously optimistic about their chances. She'd bought them time. Now she had to make sure they lived long enough to use it. The tactical frequency crackled with a new voice, gruff, authoritative, carrying the weight of command decisions that affected lives across multiple time zones. Dragon 77, this is Overlord Actual. What's your status? Overlord Actual. Colonel Marcus Webb, commanding officer of the 455th Air Expeditionary Wing and Torch's direct superior. A pilot himself, with enough combat experience to understand what she'd just accomplished in weather conditions that had grounded most of his command. Overlord Actual Dragon 77, Torch replied, banking through turbulence that would have torn lighter aircraft apart. I've neutralized multiple enemy positions around Viper 7's location. Friendlies are secure for now, one urgent surgical, ready for extraction. Copy that, Dragon. Be advised, weather conditions have deteriorated beyond safe limits for helicopter operations. Pedro Flight is grounded until visibility improves. Pedro Flight, the call sign for combat search and rescue helicopters specifically configured for extraction missions. If they were grounded, it meant Viper 7 would have to wait out the storm in their defensive position, while enemy reinforcements potentially moved toward their location. Sir, how long until conditions improve enough for extraction? Torch asked, though she suspected she wouldn't like the answer. Meteorology is calling for another 6 hours minimum, maybe longer if this storm system stalls. 6 hours, an eternity in combat time, especially for troops with limited ammunition facing an enemy that seemed to have unlimited resources to commit to their elimination. The intelligence package Viper 7 had recovered was clearly important enough to justify significant risk and expense. Overlord, recommend I remain on station to provide continuous air support until extraction is possible. There was a pause before Webb's response, filled with the kind of calculations that commanding officers made when weighing risk against necessity. Dragon 77, your fuel status doesn't support extended loitering. You need to return to base and refuel. Torch checked her gauges, seeing numbers that confirmed Webb's assessment. She had perhaps 40 minutes of flight time remaining before fuel became a critical factor. But 40 minutes might not be enough if enemy reinforcements were moving toward Viper 7's position. Sir, request emergency refueling from available tanker assets. Negative, Dragon. Weather conditions prohibit tanker operations. All aerial refueling has been suspended. The tactical situation was becoming untenable. Viper 7 needed continuous air support, but the aircraft providing that support couldn't remain on station long enough to matter. Meanwhile, enemy forces were likely regrouping and planning their next assault on troops who were running out of ammunition and options. Overlord Actual, be advised I'm declaring a tactical emergency, Torch transmitted, her voice carrying absolute conviction. I have American troops in contact with superior enemy forces, limited ammunition, and weather conditions preventing extraction. I'm remaining on station until relieved by another aircraft or until fuel state forces return to base. Another pause, longer this time. Webb was calculating risk factors that went beyond individual missions, the political implications of losing a SEAL team, the strategic value of the intelligence they'd recovered, the cost of replacing an experienced A-10 pilot if weather or enemy action brought her down. Dragon 77, understand you're declaring tactical emergency. You're authorized to remain on station at your discretion. Be advised, no other aircraft are available for relief. Copy, Overlord. Dragon 77 will maintain station. Torch banked toward a position that would allow her to observe Viper 7's location while conserving fuel. The A-10 was designed for extended loitering, but even the most efficient aircraft had limits. She calculated fuel consumption rates against time remaining until dawn, arriving at numbers that made clear this would be a one-way mission unless weather conditions improved dramatically. But some decisions weren't about mathematics. They were about the warrior ethos that bound soldiers together across service branches and specialties. The promise that no American would be left behind, no matter the cost. Viper 7, Dragon 7-7, she transmitted. I'm going to be your guardian angel until extraction. How are you holding up? Morrison's voice carried the steady calm of someone who'd made peace with whatever might come. Dragon, we're secure at this position. Chief Jackson reports no movement in the surrounding area. Package remains secure. The package, whatever intelligence materials they'd recovered during their reconnaissance mission. Something important enough that enemy forces were willing to commit significant resources to prevent its extraction. Torch found herself wondering what 8 American warriors had discovered that justified this level of response. Not that it mattered for her mission. Her job was to keep them alive long enough to get home with whatever secrets they'd uncovered. The strategic implications could be sorted out by people with more stars on their shoulders and better access to classified information. What mattered was that American troops were depending on her, and she'd never failed a mission that mattered. The storm continued to build around her, turning the cockpit into a light show of electrical discharge that made her instruments flicker with false readings. Lightning illuminated cloud formations that rose like mountains made of vapor, and wind shear tested the A-10's structural limits with gusts that would have grounded civilian aircraft weeks ago. But the Warthog was built for this kind of punishment, designed by engineers who understood that close air support meant operating in conditions that sensible people avoided. Every system had backups, and every backup had alternatives. The aircraft could fly home on one engine, navigate without GPS, and fight effectively even after taking damage that would destroy other platforms. Torch had never pushed those limits as far as she was about to. Her fuel gauges showed 35 minutes remaining at current consumption rates. She could stretch that to 50 minutes by reducing power settings and optimizing her flight profile, but that would limit her ability to respond quickly if Viper 7 came under attack. The radio crackled with a transmission that made her blood run cold. Dragon 7-7, this is Magic Eye. We're tracking multiple vehicles moving toward your area of operations. Count 12 technicals, ETA 20 minutes to Viper 7's position. 12 vehicles, potentially 50 or 60 fighters, armed with heavy weapons and supported by crews who'd learned from the destruction of their predecessors. They were committing serious resources to this fight, suggesting the intelligence package was worth almost any price. Copy Magic Eye. Viper 7, did you monitor that transmission? Dragon, we copied, Morrison replied. We're down to 3 magazines and 1 frag. If they hit us with that many troops, we're not going to hold them off for long. The mathematics were stark. 8 American Special Operations troops with limited ammunition against 50 enemy fighters with crew-served weapons and numerical superiority. Even SEAL teams had limits, and Viper 7 was approaching theirs rapidly. Torch checked her weapon status one more time. She had 600 rounds remaining for the GAU-8 cannon, plus a full pod of 2.75-inch rockets for area suppression. Enough firepower to inflict significant casualties, but probably not enough to eliminate 12 vehicle loads of enemy fighters.